if you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
Today we've got a guest that I asked when he was in Australia to come on the podcast and talk to us about horse welfare, which of course you know that's dear to my heart. We've got Dr. Roly Owers from World Horse Welfare, and he's come to talk to us today about a few different things, just to touch a bit of a broad overview, and then we'd like to get him back to talk about more specialist areas to do with the World Horse Welfare. If you don't know about World Horse Welfare, if you think about it, it's a charity that works to improve the lives of horses and the horse-human partnership in all of its guises. Roly, are you there? How are you?
Good morning, Glenys, or good evening to you. I am here and delighted to speak to you, and thanks so much for the invitation.
Oh, anything, I think, to get your message out. You did talk to us about a few other things when you were in Australia, but I think this is a bit of an introduction, so I'd like to introduce you. But before we get started, I just want to remind people about International Horse College, because the podcast is brought to you by International Horse College, and the mission of International Horse College is to improve the welfare of horses around the world through the safe education of their riders, handlers and trainers. Have a look at the wide variety of horse courses now at internationalhorsecollege.com, registered training organisation 31352. Now, Roly, just so we can get to know you a little bit more, we've sort of introduced you as the Chief Executive of World Horse Welfare, but just so we get to know you a little bit more, do you have a favourite quote, something that maybe inspired you or something that you talk to people about? You know, you find yourself repeating again and again.
Oh, I could choose so many, but I think the one I love is the Arabian proverb that the breath of heaven is that which flows between a horse's ears.
Yes.
I think there's nothing as inspiring as being on horseback, especially out in the countryside, and you're on looking out over a plain and between the horse's ears, and it's just such it's so true, and I believe it so passionately, but it is inspiring, because for me horses have always been inspiring, and that sort of encapsulates it.
And I think for those of us that have been touched by it, we know exactly what you mean, and the rest of the world thinks that we're crazy to a certain extent, I think.
Very much so.
Yeah. Now, look, we do want to talk about World Horse Welfare, and I think you joined in 2008, but it goes back a lot further than 2008, didn't it? Can you tell us a bit about World Horse Welfare, how it came about? And, I've talked a little bit, but I'm sure you've got a better story than me.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I mean, I love talking about the story of World Horse Welfare. We were founded in 1927 by Ada Cole, who witnessed British workhorses who had served all their lives on the land at the farms of England, Wales and Scotland, and they were being exported for slaughter on the continent to France and to Belgium. And she witnessed that originally actually in 1912, and that's when she first got inspired. And had it not been for the First World War, the charity World Horse Welfare would have been founded around that time. But obviously horses then were redeployed very much into the horrific carnage of the First World War. And it was only when the trade started up again in the 20s that she was inspired again to take up the cause. And what I've always found so wonderful about the charity is the fact that at the heart of it is a very pragmatic but compassionate attitude. And that's what Ada was all about. Her issue wasn't people eating horse meat. She didn't eat horse meat, and she would never intend to do so, but her issue was the conditions in which those animals were transported, and it was the welfare of those horses in their lifetime that had to be our primary concern. And so she actually campaigned to have an abattoir established in England so the horses wouldn't have to travel on this horrific journey and be slaughtered in such horrific conditions. And that pragmatism, but that caring pragmatism, is something that is very much at the heart of the charity today, because in a world of the 21st century, I don't think it's ever been a more important time to have a caring but pragmatic voice standing and speaking for horse welfare.
Yes, yes, yes. And I'm thinking to do with horse welfare, we've got the staff there. And you're a vet, aren't you? You're a veterinary
That's right.
surgeon. Yep. So you've come in very well qualified, besides being a rider, to be there as a veterinary surgeon. The other people that work, not the volunteers, because I'm sure you've got lots of volunteers, lots of patrons, trustees, people coming for work experience, but the actual staff that look after the main part, because we talk about careers with horses, and I think careers with horses are widening up to a much wider degree. It used to be, oh, you like horses, you should be a vet. And you were probably told that when you were young, but there's lots of other work with horses and in the horse industry. So can you tell us a bit about some of the other staff at World Horse Welfare?
Yes, certainly. I mean, as you say, the horse sector, the equine sector is such a large one, and there are so many ways to be involved. Clearly, the majority, a big part of what we do is rescue and rehoming in the UK.
Yep.
And therefore, we have a lot of the team who are involved in direct care of the 400 at the moment. Normally we have 300, but it's a sign of the times. We have 400 horses in our care in the 4 centres we have. So we take in horses that have suffered abuse and neglect, we rehabilitate them, and then we will rehome them. And so a significant proportion of our staff are involved in the care of the horses, the maintenance of our 4 centres. And so you could view that as very traditional, sort of very important, but very traditional sort of involvement as grooms, as managers, and all the allied professionals that go in with that rehabilitation work. But then we also have a growing element of our work internationally in low and middle income countries where equines are still viewed as working animals. And there, in normal times, we have community-based projects working with working equine owners those animals is the means for their very livelihood. And so we are working with them, with local providers, farriers and saddlers, and also with the local veterinary services as well. So that's a growing area of our work. And then the third area of our operational work is our work around education and advocacy. So the biggest reason for horse welfare neglect around the world is ignorance. And therefore, we need to do it. It obviously very much ties in with what you're doing there in Brisbane, is that, education is such an important part of the equation to support and enhance equine welfare. But also we recognise as part of our work is advocacy. We need to change what policymakers, we need to change the laws because we're in countries across the world. Because if you can do that, rather than helping the ones and the tens, which we can do directly through, for example, our centre or our community-based projects, internationally, if you change policy, you change attitudes and you change laws, which are then enforced, you're impacting millions of horses. And so, the involvement and the type of skill sets and backgrounds of people who work for World Horse Welfare, before I even talk about the core competencies of fundraising and finance and human resources and everything else, is considerable.
Okay. Now, just a word you said back there was equines. When you say equines, we're just talking horses, or we're going a bit wider than horses?
So we are going wider than horses. So despite our name of World Horse Welfare, our charitable objectives are around the protection and enhancement of welfare of equine. So we're talking horses, donkeys and mules.
Okay. Now, for someone, we talked about the staff, someone who would like to work in the horse industry, work within World Horse Welfare, I'm sure when you interview people, you come across people, everyone wants to work there, everyone wants to help out. They start off as a volunteer and then everyone wants a job. But what sort of core skills and character traits are you looking for if you're going to employ someone, have them on staff as opposed to a volunteer?
I suppose it's a good question. The reality is it very much depends on the role, because for some roles, as bizarre as it might sound, actually having an equine background is not required. I'm thinking especially of the support skills of fundraising and finance, for example, but also in our international team, the focus there is very much on community development, is very much on the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the background in equine care and equine understanding is not so important. Clearly, if you're working on our centres and our farms where there is frontline care of the animals, then that equine background is important. But I think the two major requirements is to have an empathy, have an understanding and a support of what the charity is seeking to achieve. And when we talk about that, at the beginning, I talked about the pragmatism of the charity. Mm-hmm. And that can be quite difficult because, for example, we can't save every horse. And therefore, euthanasia, certainly on our farms, is something that we need to be very mindful of and understand that euthanasia can be the right welfare choice for some horses. And that's sometimes we don't run a sanctuary. So we don't believe in horses just running in pastures, and because we're very much focused around quality of life, mm-hmm. And rather than quantity of life.
Yes.
So that can be quite a difficult challenge to understand. So people, whatever their role, whether they're on the front line of the equine care or not, they need to understand the ethos of the charity, how caring but pragmatic it is. And of course, and it's somewhat corny to say, but we are a team, we are a family, and it's close-knit. And especially going through times like now that we're experiencing in the first quarter of 2020, it is so important that we can work as a team and work together. And of course, at times people work on their own and they need to sort of get on and do their own individual jobs. But the vast majority of the time, it is not lone working, it's not solo working, it's team working. And that is that some people are happier with that than others. And so people need to be happy with that and join a team.
And what do they say is the best thing about working for World Horse Welfare?
God, that's a good question. You're probably asking the wrong person, to be honest. Because
what do you think? I should say, what do you think is the best thing about working for World Horse Welfare?
I think it's the passion of the charity and what we stand here to do. I mean, we're doing something in many regards, something that we believe very strongly personally, and to support and enhance equine welfare. And many, not all, as I've said, have an equine background, and therefore you're sort of doing something in your work time that you would love to do in your own time. Just having an association and working with horses.
Yep.
I think that pragmatism and that compassion, which are the sort of two of the core values of the organisation, I think people really appreciate and enjoy and are enthused by that. And the fact that we work in a place where, not all outcomes are happy ones, mm-hmm. but there are lots of happy outcomes. And therefore, it's really good to be able to celebrate those successes, those animals that came into us, which were almost at death's door, and we rehabilitate them and find them loving new homes. It's stories like those good news stories, which are so important at times like at the moment, that really do inspire people.
Yeah. Okay. And you said earlier, we're talking about the first quarter of 2020. So because podcasts are very good, because we do have people going back, discovering our podcast, going back, listening to all the previous ones, because we're not really dated. But we are going to date this, and just let us know what changes there's been with this worldwide pandemic of COVID-19, how it's changed your work and anything that you do that's different. I noticed that your shop's closed. Anything else?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how it's affected what you do.
Well, it has been just like for so many organisations and so many people, it's been transformational. The last couple of weeks have been extraordinary, unprecedented, and all of these terms we hear so much. And it's exactly the same for World Horse Welfare. As you say, our centres are closed. Tragically, our rehoming scheme has closed. We rescue and rehabilitate, and the way we can free up space in our centres is by rehoming horses. And we've got nearly 2,000 out in homes around the UK. although we're still taking online applications, obviously people can't come into our centres and we can't rehome horses from our centres for the moment. Our field officers in the UK are only answering emergency calls, and therefore we're not out. And the reality is we receive calls from the members of the general public to highlight sort of potential welfare concerns. And of course, we're not getting hardly any telephone calls around welfare because people are staying at home and aren't out and about. And of course, from our international projects, that's been profound as well, because we work in lots of places across Central America and South Africa. Actually, we work in China. Obviously, haven't been there recently, and out in Southeast Asia too. So all areas where either they've had really bad sort of outcomes or sort of restrictions around the pandemic, or are just starting to go through that. So, and of course, I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of advocacy work. And so we're always looking to enhance horse welfare policy, equine welfare policy and legislation. But of course, the priorities of governments, understandably at the moment, are very much focused on trying to control the pandemic and get us through this extraordinary, horrific times.
All right. So when the pandemic's over, and you go back to the rehoming, tell us what happens if someone wants to rehome a horse. What type of person would they be? What are you looking for? Because I'm sure you're not going to just give out horses to anyone who comes in. Just tell us a little bit about and what expectations you would have of the new owner.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, at the moment, we're only rehoming in the UK, so it's not something that directly would work if you're living in Australia, but there are many charities in Australia which do a similar role. But we are looking for someone who's got the time and the ability to give a horse a second chance in life. Those type of horses vary considerably. So we are taking in a lot of mares in foal or with foals at foot. So we have a lot of youngsters. And so it could be someone who's got the time to handle a youngster, bring it on, and if appropriate, back them as well. But if they don't want to do that, they can come back into us, and we will do that. We have at the other end of the scale, we have a number of horses which, for whatever reason, through poor breeding or through what they've had to live through during their lives to date, they're unable to be ridden. So they are companion animals. And so obviously that they still need care, but a different type of care to one which is being ridden. And obviously in the middle, we have a lot of horses that we rehome as light hacks, to people who just want to enjoy them for a chance to get out into the countryside and go for a ride. We do have some that have joined the police, that have joined the riding disabled, have joined the army, been on ceremonial duty for, the William and Kate's wedding and the Queen Mother's funeral. So we do have some that have gone on to sort of great things. Actually, in the past, we had one horse that went to the World Equestrian Games as a full-thing horse. So there's all sorts. But obviously what we're primarily looking for is someone who's got the time and the care to be able to give a horse a second chance in life.
I was going to ask you about case studies, but you sort of already told us a few. Has there been one that you've been personally involved with that you think, this was a really good, standout for you, something that's major? I mean, you're particularly proud anyway, having a horse competing at the World Equestrian Games and police horses and riding for disabled. There's lots of things you'd be proud of, but anything in particular, or is there anything more recent that you've come across?
We did come across just before Christmas, and I think it was 3 years ago. It might have been a bit longer, so years merge into one. But we took in a young colt called Rudolph, which we named Rudolph, and it was not surprisingly, it was just before Christmas.
Yes, and
he only had one eye, and he was in a terrible state. And we obviously used him because we used him as our face of our Christmas sort of message. The fact that even at times like this, people's support can help us turn a life around like Rudolph's. And it was just given the time of year and and given the role he played for us, because, obviously we need to get that message out there, and we need to tell that message through case studies. And Rudolph was a very special one because it was a very unusual for us recently. It was a very cold winter, and it was obviously Christmas time, which obviously always brings that sort of added sort of element of emotion too.
I'm thinking about, and as you say, sometimes it's ignorance. Sometimes it's people thinking that they're doing the right thing, but it not necessarily is the right thing. So have you got something that you'd say is a fairly common thing, that people think that they're doing it right, but they're actually not doing it right, that you'd like to get out there?
Oh, in terms of educational challenges, and if we look across, and we're especially looking a lot across the more equine developed nations, so Australia, New Zealand, the US, many parts of Europe, I think the biggest welfare challenge is obesity. It's horses being overweight. And that is a huge challenge. Everyone understands, or a lot of people understand, the health implications for human obesity. But the reality is the health implications for equines is far more significant. And we've created a disease called equine metabolic syndrome through the way we've managed them. And it's really difficult to get that message across because people feel they're doing the right thing. But the saying, killing their horses with kindness, it couldn't be nearer to the truth, because that's what people are doing when they're allowing their horses to get overweight and then obese. They're over-rugging them, they're overfeeding them, they're under-exercising them. And actually it's those messages that we need to get out, that people need to really recognize that, horses are horses, and we really need, in the way we manage them, recognize where they've come from an evolutionary point of view. The fact that they would graze, they would be on the plains in herds, grazing for 17 hours a day. And that kind of background and thinking we need to really sort of implement into our day-to-day management of the horses. And as I say, the health implications through laminitis, through EMS, through obviously joint problems and so many other issues that come as a result of obesity is a huge challenge, and one which is quite difficult to get across because it's not someone being cruel, it's someone thinking they're doing the right thing when they absolutely are not.
Yeah. Now, thinking about, you said that's a challenge, but thinking of the charity, and particularly in the early stages, to get that charity going, and let's say money aside, because that's always a problem. What do you think the biggest problem was for Ava when she was getting this charity going, getting the movement going and getting people to recognise that there was a problem there? She was female, and this is sort of, going back, how long's the charity been there? 90 years, is it? Nearly 100 years ago, a female in the UK. Tell us about some of the problems that she might have had, or have you got any stories about, I don't know, male people who are taking horses across Europe, male, people driving? Yeah. Just tell us a little bit about that.
The reality is, if you look at the history of most animal welfare charities, especially in the UK, they have been founded by very headstrong, very driven females. So I'm thinking of the RSPCA and the Brook Hospital for Animals and Spana and World Horse Welfare and many, many others, and more recently the Donkey Sanctuary. They've all been set up by women who had a huge passion and weren't going to say no for an answer type of people. And so, yes, in the 1920s, obviously, it was very much the suffragettes' time, and, the world was a very different place then. Mm-hmm. But I don't ever get an impression from reading the history books that actually sexism or being a female was a hindrance.
Okay.
And I'm fairly sure that Ada would have used it to her advantage. So I think that would have been sort of an added sort of red rag to a bull type thing, to drive her on. But I think the biggest challenge then is our Animal Welfare Act dates back from 1911. And so the concept of animal welfare is still relatively new in the 1920s. And obviously, animal sentience, as we now know, didn't come along till much later. So I think one of the biggest challenges was getting an understanding that just because an animal's an animal, it shouldn't be treated in a compassionate and caring way. And I think people would view, as some still do tragically today, view horses as like white goods, something that you could turn on and turn off or just use and then throw out. And I think that would have been a real challenge to get people to understand, saying this is wrong, when you think, well, why is it wrong? I mean, that's the way we use horses. That's fine. Well, clearly it's not fine, and it wasn't fine then any more than it is now. But I think that mindset was a huge challenge.
Okay. Now, moving forward, and I know that we've got a big problem now that you've probably got plans on hold, but what are the plans? What are you working on? What projects were you working on?
So a number of different projects. We were founded, as I mentioned earlier, around transport and slaughter as an issue. And we're still very much focused around that. There is still a trade. There was a trade up until recently, and it will no doubt restart, the long-distance transport of horses to slaughter across Europe. And so we recognise that across the world, that horse meat is still consumed in many, many different countries. And therefore, it is so important that the care of those horses during their lifetime is protected, is prioritised. And therefore, within Europe and increasingly in North America, but also in places like China, that remains very much a focus. And for Europe, we've set ourselves a target to end the long-distance transport of horses to slaughter within Europe by our centenary, by 2027. So that's a key focus for us. We are in the UK, but also because so much of it is digitally driven, we are looking to significantly enhance our educational outreach. We see there's so much wonderful education out there. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we are trying to bring that practical approach, the day-to-day management skills to people so that they can understand. And a great example of that, we got a video online of how to take your horse's temperature, pulse and respiration, which is sort of a basic way of maintaining and monitoring our horse's health. And that has been hugely popular. So I think we're looking to do that, but also we recognise that, as I said earlier, the challenges for education are as relevant to Guatemala as they are to England or anywhere else. And therefore, trying to make that an international message and obviously translate those messages as far as we can. And then something that I was obviously down in Australia recently with talking about is the future of horse sport, which obviously has its own challenges right now, but we're living in a very changing society. And therefore, horse sport has got to recognise that and reflect on how it needs to change for a long-term future, and a concept known as the social licence. For horse sport to flourish in the future, it needs to maintain and enhance its social licence. And we, as welfare advisors to the International Equestrian Federation and various racing jurisdictions, believe that is a huge priority when life returns to normal later in the year, hopefully.
And I think if people would like to have a look at any of that, because the website, worldhorsewelfare.org, there is quite a lot. It's quite a big website. There's quite a few pages, and there's a lot of advice and videos and news and articles and things like that. And good news stories too, which is always nice to read, isn't it? So,
very much so.
Yeah. Roly, thank you so much for coming on. It's been, very good to talk to you, to hear in a bit more depth and to spread the word, I think, about World Horse Welfare and, the good work that you're doing around the globe and, how people can support you. And just, just that one signature, just that small donation, just that little bit, I'm sure that it all helps. And I think if the horse world sort of pulls together to support you, then you'll be able to go onwards and upwards and continue to do the wonderful work that you do. So thank you.
Glenys, thank you. You're so right. literally every bit does help. So whatever people can do to support, even if that's just spreading the word, then we would. It really does make a difference.
Brilliant. All right. Well, let's hope that this COVID-19 pandemic is over soon so that people can continue to support you and you can keep going a little bit quicker without things like that to slow us down. Thank you.
Glenys, thank you so much. It's been lovely to chat to you.
Lovely to chat to you too, Roly. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed this chat, then please comment, rate and subscribe. If you'd like any changes or recommendations for guests, then please contact us through horsechats.com. And while you're online, have a look at the government-accredited courses at internationalhorsecollege.com. Registered Training Organisation 31352.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.